to what we have called the SDG 4 Data Week. We have 2 sessions today and coming Friday, looking at various aspects of the measurement in particular of SDG 4. SDG 4, and Friedrich will say more about this, has a whole battery of indicators which can be challenging to the extent you don't necessarily know how to approach them and how to handle them. So we're very privileged to have amongst the key experts on these topics here with us today and Friday. And we also have the privilege that the Institute of Statistics has chosen Geneva and NORRAG to launch this fantastic guide that will hopefully be very useful to all of us working in the field of education and in the field of reporting on the indicators in particular. So together with the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation's Education Network, we're very happy to welcome you here. And we hope to see you back also on Friday. So the format of this event is interactive, so we'll have a number of presentations by Sabina first as a word of welcome, and then by Friedrich, and then we'll open it up as we go, and you agreed to that, Friedrich, to questions and answers as you present, so to make it a little bit interactive. It's a brown bag lunch. Unfortunately, you will have to wait till the end of the session before you'll get the food. Unfortunately, we cannot eat in this room, so please stay with us, bear with us as we go along. We are, as said, we're also live streaming this event, so if there's questions, and I say hello to all those that follow us around the world, hopefully you can send them via Facebook and we will take them as we go. I think as a word of introduction, this should do. Before giving the floor to the speakers, I would like to briefly welcome and thank both speakers again for joining us here. Sabina Handshin is the education focal point at the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, SDC, as we mostly call it. Since May this year, last 2016, she has a technical background in education, conflict sensitivity, fragility, and in humanitarian assistance. Prior to working with SDC, she worked for 2 years at Swiss Peace in Bern, providing strategy and capacity support to governmental and non-governmental organizations on issues related to program implementation in fragile contexts. She was also an education specialist with UNICEF for a number of years, for 5 years, and which brought you to many African countries, including Congo, the Central African Republic, and the regional office for West and Central Africa in Dakar. You may want to say a bit more, but this sort of gives the outline of your very rich career and your strong background on the field of education and also the field of measurement that we will discuss today. Friedrich Huebler is the head of the Education Standards and Methodology section at the UNESCO Institute of Statistics. The section is in charge of indicators, methodology analysis of household survey data on education, with an emphasis on monitoring of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Before he joined UIS, which is quite recent, I think.
No, it's not been 9 years ago.
Okay, sorry. He worked as statistics and monitoring. Sorry, you're right. Yeah, Patrick gave me the information. He worked as statistics and monitoring specialist at UNICEF, and he holds a PhD in economics from the New School of Social Research in New York. So without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Sabina for a few welcoming remarks.
Thank you very much, Joost. Thank you very much, norrag, for inviting us here to this exciting event. And I'm really, really looking forward to the presentation from Friedrich, because you must know I'm a social anthropologist and not a statistician. So usually social anthropologists, they are more interested in qualitative data. We know how to ask questions, how to listen, but we are quite nil in statistics. Nevertheless, I love statistics, and I love particularly education statistics. And I'm not flattering you now, Friedrich. I could spend hours on the UIS website. Because for me, statistics, not that I necessarily understand them, but for me, they are like keys into particular rooms. So if you have data, there is something behind data. There are social realities, cultural realities, political realities behind data. And that's then my field. But I need the data as an entry point. So let me give you an example. I just came back from a mission to Jordan. And the Jordan ministry has just launched its very first education sector plan, or education sector strategy. And when I looked at the data piece, it was very interesting, and it struck me that there the problem is with boys and not girls. So if you look at retention rate and repetition rates of boys, they are far worse than of girls. So I had a question mark. Why is that? And I started to question. Then my anthropological hat came. I started to question. We did interviews with teachers, with children, with boys in boys' schools, and we found out the more social dimensions behind it, in terms of violence at school, in terms of the boys needing to look for livelihood, in terms of the teacher quality, because teachers in boys' schools are worse, have a better quality than in girls' school, because no one wants to teach in a boys' school because of the different parameters. So actually data led me then to social and cultural and political realities. So that's just a very small introduction. Now we come to SDG 4. SDG 4 is ambitious and it's complex. And we need data and indicators to make kind of sense of this complexity, but also to, on the one hand, measure whether we have progress with regards to SDG 4 and 2030, that we can, as donors and multilateral, report that we still are worth investing, that tax paying is still worth investing in development cooperation and others. But I think more importantly for ministries to see whether we reach the common vision of that each girl and each boy, no matter of which context, whether in crisis settings or not, whether in rural areas or not, do actually achieve quality education by 2030. So that's why we need data and indicators. But this is a collective responsibility, of course, of national governments as the primary responsible for delivering, monitoring, following up on education, but also, as we say at SDC, education is for us not just a public good, but also a common good, because it's the international and the collective responsibility to achieve really equal and equitable education for all. So our role and our mandate as agency in development cooperation is to support governments in doing so. For that, we need commonly agreed indicators. And I think the SDG 4 is really fantastic with these commonly agreed indicators, even though they are debated, and I think it has to be the way, but still commonly agreed indicators are for us, or in my understanding, a key thing in terms of systems approach. Because we all strive towards the same objective, and indicators do force us to do so, and even those that might not have that vision yet and might not yet really use the indicators, sooner or later they will have to, because I think that is really our common understanding. our common language also, how we will achieve education for all, and what do we need to do that, to do so. But an educator is just as good as the data it creates, and we all know to get reliable data, particularly in the countries where we as SDC work, is not such an easy task. Even though I must say, I used to work in Chad, and Chad has one of the most fragile education systems. And we can say about the data what we want in terms of reliability or not, but they do have some sort of data. And I must say, having worked in Eastern Chad, in little villages, being cut off by wadis, by rivers during the rainy season, having inspectors that have no motorcycle, that have hardly a paper and a pen, but still the ministry somehow manages to have data. Whether they are good or not, that's another issue, but I always have a lot of admiration for this type of data as well, and for the data collection and management of data in these countries. But we need to help governments to provide, to have the efforts and to have the tools and capacity to have that data. But data should not be there for the sake of data. Data is just as good as we use it. So, and I think there much more effort still needs to be made in terms of how to make use then of data, because that's a whole other skill set. How to analyze data, how to have the capacity to interpret it, but then not only that, also to translate it in actions. So to conclude, data, even as a social anthropologist, and quantitative indicators are extremely interesting and important. And I think they represent a little bit what we understand, what is our vision in terms of education and equity in education. And there I think I would just like to flag two things that I think in the current SDG 4 indicators we have not regarded sufficiently yet. So I use that as a little advocacy bracket. I think we still need to put more emphasis on what do we understand by holistic quality education. For example, quality learning environment. Is it just having latrines, etc., as SDG 4, the SDG related SDG indicator says, or does it also include aspects of psychosocial and physical well-being, and how do we measure that? And secondly, I think much more effort still need to be done, given the world that becomes more and more fragile. Crisis, refugees, IDPs, access to education is a major barrier to achieve SDG 4, and I think we should still do more efforts to really integrate data on IDPs and refugees in the official SDG 4 targets and reporting, but then of course also at national level. From SDC, we really love data and we support data. We support the GP, we support IIP, we support also the Global Education Monitoring Report, or BASEC for West Africa. And we are about to set up a partnership with the INE, Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, which very much focuses now on data and evidence in crisis context as well. So the floor.
Just to add
yours.
to that, I mean, all these different partnerships are part of the new SDC strategy.
Thank you.
For basic education and vocational skills development, which is new and which was adopted last year. So I invite you, there's a number of copies there. It's a very good read also as an introduction to the whole international education field. But so I invite you to take some copies if you wish. Thanks for this introduction, Sabina. You coined already a few questions and issues. I mean, you can have endless discussions about indicators and about their value also in terms of, can you really measure everything that counts? So with that being said, Friedrich, the floor is yours. And as you go along, and if there's questions emerging, we can take them as we go. And I would just, in case there is questions from the audience as we go, we will have to repeat it so that we can speak into the microphone and that the people online live stream following us can also hear the question. Okay. That being said, Friedrich, the floor is yours.
So let me jump right into my presentation. But first, maybe I should say something about the UIS, because not everyone may be familiar with this organization. The UNESCO Institute for Statistics is the statistical institute of UNESCO. We were established in 1999 to enhance the statistical capacity of UNESCO. And we are based in Montreal. We have a staff of about 80, which includes a limited field presence in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. And we work in all areas of statistics of UNESCO that UNESCO covers. So that's education, science, culture, and communication. But most of our work is in the field of education because it's such an important part of UNESCO. And the US is also the custodian agency for the indicators under SDG 4.
I think you have to point it a little
Which
bit
one?
towards
Which
there.
one are they pushing? Oh, okay, got it. So my presentation is broadly divided into two parts. In the first part, I will speak about the indicator framework for SDG 4. Here we'll talk about the targets and about the global and thematic indicators. I will also say a few things about monitoring of progress and reporting of progress. And I have about 30 minutes of material to present. But as Joost already said, I'm very happy to take questions at any time. So please feel free to interrupt me. I think that makes it a bit more interesting, a bit more lively, the whole event. Then in the second part, I have about 15 minutes to talk more about the work of the UIS specifically in the field of SDG for monitoring. And there we'll also introduce some of our products, including this new report that we are launching today at this event. So the SDGs, I think as everybody in this room knows, were adopted in 2015 by the UN General Assembly. There were a total of 17 goals, including one on education. It's SDG 4. And that goal calls for inclusive and equitable quality education and lifelong learning opportunities for all by 2030. So you can see that this is a very and a goal with a very broad scope. First of all, it talks about lifelong learning from pre-primary education to adult education. This is a big difference to the MDGs, which really only looked at or focused very much on primary education. It also looks at the quality of education, which was not covered in the MDGs. And of course, one important aspect of the SDGs is this emphasis on inclusion and equity, which is also something that is broader than in the MDGs, where there was really just an emphasis on gender parity. In the SDGs, we're also looking at disparities linked to location, wealth, disability, and many other dimensions of disaggregation. So the SDG 4 targets were adopted at the same time as the goals in 2015. There are a total of 10 targets under SDG 4. I'm not going to go through them in detail now. Just to say that they cover primary and secondary education. They talk about access to pre-primary technical, vocational, and tertiary education. It talks about skills for employment. There is a target related to gender equality and inclusion. As already mentioned, there is one that is about literacy and numeracy. It talks about education for sustainable development and global citizenship. And then there are three so-called means of implementation. Those are targets that in a way have to be, that help achieve the other targets under SDG 4. And here we're looking at the learning environment. This is one thing that Sabina already mentioned, scholarships and teachers. So not everyone knows that there are actually two related frameworks for SDG 4. There's a global indicator framework and a thematic indicator framework. The global indicator framework was developed by the UN system broadly. The UN General Assembly in 2014 gave a mandate to the UN Statistical Commission to develop this framework. And the UNSC in turn endorsed the establishment of an important group, the so-called Interagency and Expert Group on SDG indicators. This is the key group that defined the indicators and develops them to this day and keeps developing them. This group started working in 2015, and it is composed of representatives from national statistical offices. That's very important to know here when we look at the SDGs. The SDGs are really a country-driven initiative. Again, different from the MDGs. At the time of the MDGs, the goals and the targets and the indicators were defined by agencies. So you would have UNESCO, World Bank, UNICEF, and other agencies that defined everything. Here, it is now countries that define the goals, the targets, and the indicators through the IAEG. There are also observers present. This includes multilateral agencies, international organizations, civil society, and academia. And the IAEG worked for about 2 years until the proposal that was adopted finally in July of 2017 by the UN General Assembly. And this is the indicator framework that we have in place today. So there are a total of 11 indicators in this global framework for 10 targets. That means that one target has 2 indicators. Again, I will not go through all of these indicators. I will just mention as an example the global indicator for target 4.1, which is universal primary and secondary education, because that's an interesting indicator when you look at this target, and I will explain in a moment why. The global indicator for this target, so universal primary and secondary education, is an indicator that measures the proportion of children and young people in primary and secondary education who achieve minimum proficiency in reading and math. And it's measured at 3 points in the education system in grade 2 or 3, at the end of primary and at the end of lower secondary education. And you can tell immediately that's not really an indicator that measures universal primary and secondary education. It measures only a part of that. For example, this has no information on how many children go to school. It has no information on learning among children and young people who are not in school. And that's why there is this need for this thematic indicator framework that I will talk about in a moment, that complements the global indicator framework. But still, there are these key indicators in the global framework, a small number that is used to capture some of the key trends related to all of these targets. So we have indicators for all of the individual targets under SDG 4. Again, I will not go through the whole list. There will be an opportunity to talk more about the individual indicators later. Now, looking at the thematic indicator framework, this, as I said, complements the global indicator framework to provide a more in-depth view of the education sector, of SDG 4 in particular. And here, this is a process that was led by UNESCO, the development of this thematic indicator framework. In 2014, UNESCO established a so-called Technical Advisory Group that is chaired by the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, and that had as members experts from OECD, UNESCO, UNICEF, World Bank, and the Global Education Monitoring Report. That group developed a draft proposal that was discussed in 2015 at the World Education Forum in South Korea. And one recommendation of that World Education Forum was to expand the group to include representatives of member states, because there was a difference here. If you look at the global process, the indicators were defined by countries, by member states. That was not the case in the thematic indicators, but that was corrected after 2015. So from 2015, this expanded group developed a proposal that was then adopted in November 2015 by the UNESCO General Conference. And UNESCO General Conference means this is the annual assembly of member states of UNESCO. These indicators are complementary, as I said. They complement each other. One advantage was that when the thematic indicators were developed, they knew already what the global indicators were. So there is a set of 43 thematic indicators that have been developed and that are used to monitor now, and that includes the 11 global indicators. To give one example of how the thematic indicators provide more information, I'll come back to an example that Sabina mentioned. This is about the school environment. The global indicator is an indicator that looks only at resources. For example, it looks at computer access, it looks at schools connected to the internet, it looks at the presence of sanitation facilities. So it's a purely resource-based measure that gives a partial picture of the situation that the children learn in. The thematic indicators complement that by, for example, there are two thematic indicators that are added to that. One looks at bullying in school, and the other one measures the number of attacks on student personnel and facilities. So with that, we get some additional information on schools safe in the country to learn. Another example that I want to talk about is, and this brings me back to the global indicator for target 4.1. So the target 4.1 was this universal primary and secondary education, and as we heard earlier, the global indicator only looks at learning outcomes. On this slide, you see also the 6 thematic indicators for target 4.1, and you see that they provide a lot of additional information. For example, there is indicator 4.1.2, which captures whether a country even carries out learning assessments. There are 2 indicators that look at completion of primary and secondary education, the gross intake ratio to the last grade and the completion rate. There are 2 measures of participation, the out of school rate and the percentage of children who are over age for the grade. And then there is a measure of the provision of education that counts the number of years of free and compulsory primary and secondary education in a country. So taken together, the global and thematic indicator, I would argue, really provide a very comprehensive picture of education systems in the country. And if we get data for all of them, it will be a lot easier for us to assess whether countries are on a good path to reaching the SDG 4 targets by 2030. Both the global and thematic indicators are still undergoing development, at least some of them. And for that, the IAAG has developed a classification of indicators. There is a tier classification where there are 3 tiers of indicators. And the first tier are those indicators at the highest level of development. So these includes indicators that have an internationally accepted methodology, and they are also indicators for which at least half of all countries produce data on a regular basis. Tier 2 indicators are those for which there is also an internationally accepted methodology, but data are not regularly produced by the majority of countries. And then there is the third tier. These are indicators for which there is no established methodology, and because of that there is also no data collection or limited data collection. The indicators that require further development are shown on this slide. Here are the 4 global indicators that are classified by the IAAG as requiring further development. This includes among them 1 sub-indicator for target 4.1, that's learning outcomes in grade 2 or 3, or the quality of education in grade 2 or 3 of primary education, because there is no accepted or internationally accepted measurement tool for that assesses the quality of education and learning outcomes in grade 2 or 3. There are programs such as PISA that look at higher levels in higher stages in the education system, but there isn't really anything that looks at grade 2 or 3. So that particular part is still classified as tier 3. An other example is here this indicator 4.2.1, which measures the proportion of children under 5 who are developmentally on track. Here the problem is there is really no definition of what it means to be developmentally on track. That's why this is also an indicator that is still in tier 3. And then there is a set of 11 thematic indicators that also require further development. These are not classified by the IAAG. These are defined by the group working on the thematic indicators as requiring further development. The refinement of the global indicator framework is led by the UN and as a technical lead the IAAG. They have an annual review of the indicators at which they also consider reclassification requests. As an example, in 2017, there was a request to reclassify this indicator that looks at learning outcomes in grade 2 or 3 from grade tier 3 to tier 2, but that was rejected by the IAG. And there's also, in addition, a more comprehensive review of the entire indicator set that takes place every 5 years by the UN Statistical Commission. So that will be in 2020 and 2025. And at that point, there's also an opportunity to drop indicators or to add indicators. So let's say if by 2020 and tier 3 indicator has not reached at least tier 2, I would say there's a high probability that it would be dropped from the framework.
There's a question online here,
yes,
asking why is 4.7.3 being dropped as an indicator?
Okay.
Yeah.
Now I have to say, what is 4.7.3?
Yes.
4.73 is, and I have to look at my own cheat sheet, yes, because it's really hard to keep track 43 indicators. Yes. So it's a measure that looks at the. I will just read out the indicator. It's the extent to which the framework on the World Program on Human Rights Education is implemented nationally. So the reason that it's dropped, this was an indicator that was requested by, I think, the UN High Commissioner on Refugees. I'm not sure, no, sorry. Sorry, I don't know who requested an indicator. The issue is, however, that there's a related indicator, 4.7.1, and I have that on the previous slide. So I can go back to that. It's here on this, no, it's not on here because 4.7.3 is here as in one that requires further development. So I don't have that here now. The indicator is, so 4.71 is a related indicator that looks at the extent to which global citizenship education and education for sustainable development are mainstreamed in national education systems. So you see that's related to 4.7.3. There was no accepted methodology for 4.7.1 until this year. But now there is a methodology, and because of that, the agency that requested 4.7.3, and I'm sorry that I don't remember now what that agency was, has agreed to have 4.7.3 dropped. So this is an agreement between UNESCO and the other agency that 4.7.3 is no longer needed because the data for this indicator is, the information in this indicator is captured by 4.7.1. So now we come to levels of monitoring. Again, if I want to invite anyone in the room also to ask questions at any time. I'm very happy to answer them. If you raise your hand, if I don't see you, then someone else will ask. So here's Patrick with a question. Yeah. Yes, okay, I have to repeat the question. So the question was, what is the commitment of countries to the indicator framework and monitoring? That's an important question, and we get that question on a regular basis. And I have to say, depending on who you talk to, you will get a different answer. So, but today you're asking me, and I will give you my answer. The indicators are, and I have that actually later in my presentation, well, I can talk about that now, are according to they were adopted in 2017 by the UN General Assembly, and that resolution says that it is a voluntary and country-led framework. So the word voluntary is there in the resolution. That means, strictly speaking, there is no obligation by countries to follow that framework and to report data on progress. But at the same time, I would argue, because countries committed to achieving these goals by 2030, there is a commitment to achieve all of these targets, because the goal includes all of the targets that were adopted in 2015, and they are measured with the global and thematic indicators. So the expectation is that countries would at least report on the global indicators, and preferably also on the thematic indicators, to give a complete picture of their national education systems. And I will talk in a moment more about how this reporting of progress works, because there are these so-called voluntary national reviews that they carry out, where they would then provide information on the indicators. So now continuing with the levels of monitoring, there are a total of 4 levels of monitoring, and 2 of those we already talked about. That's the global level, which is based on the global set of indicators, and then there is the thematic level, which is around the thematic indicators. There's also a regional level of monitoring that's really important. That is coordinated by UN regional commissions. And this is an opportunity for countries in the region to get together to exchange information or to discuss matters that might be of particular relevance in a certain region. And then, of course, there is the national level. And here one of the challenges that some or many countries face is to integrate SDG 4 into their national education sector plans, because there may be targets or indicators that have not really been considered in national education sector plans. For example, if you look at inclusion or equity, persons with disabilities are specifically mentioned in the global indicator framework, but perhaps national, let's say, education management information systems don't have a way of tracking how children with disabilities perform relative to children who don't have disabilities. So that would be something that would have to be changed in the country to be able to report on the indicators and to achieve the goal for everyone in the population. Data sources. There are 3 types of data broadly that are considered for monitoring of SDG 4. And I also want to come back here to the resolution from 2017 in which the SDG framework was adopted, a global framework. It says that, and I quote, "Official statistics and data from the national statistical systems constitute the basis needed for the global indicator framework." So that really means we need strong national systems that can collect the data, that can analyze the data also, and then make the data available to policymakers in the country. Now, coming to the main data sources, the first one are administrative data. This includes, for example, data from school censuses that are typically maintained in education management information systems. There are household surveys. This includes, among others, international survey programs, for example, demographic and health surveys, or the multiple indicator cluster surveys. The former are sponsored by USAID, and the mixed are sponsored by UNICEF. There are also national surveys, and there are population censuses that could serve as a source of data in this field. And these sources of data have become increasingly important, or very important, with the SDGs because of this emphasis on equity. If you look at administrative data, there is very often a limited scope for disaggregation. Let's say countries report highly aggregated data to the UIS. And very often the only disaggregation that's possible is by age and sex. If you want to know more, for example, how do rural populations compare to urban populations, or how do children from wealthier households perform relative to children from poorer households, we have to look at other sources of data, specifically household surveys. And the third source of data are learning assessments. This includes especially cross-national learning assessments such as PASEC, PEARLS, PISA, SAC-MEC, TIMSS, and the emphasis here on cross-national assessments because of this need for comparable data. And these assessments, by definition, because they are cross-national, provide a means of comparing different countries with each other. National assessments are very different if you compare them often, so it's very difficult to compare data. This is actually one of the main challenges in learning assessments, and one of the reasons why the indicators for measurement of learning outcomes are partly tier 3 or tier 2. Data availability is often not very good.
You have to push the button.
I have to push the button, yeah. I'm on the right slide now. See, this is not the most recent data. This is data from 2016. I didn't have a chance to update this to something more recent. But the situation hasn't really improved very much since 2016. This graph here lists the 11 global indicators, and then they show for each indicator which proportion of countries has data. So this ranges from 76% of countries for indicators to teach for teachers, but that means 76% of countries have no data for the teacher indicators, and it goes to sorry, I'm doing it the wrong way. 76% of countries have data on teachers, and 9% of countries have data on ICT skills. There is some improvement since then, but it's still quite low. And remember that one of the criteria for classifying an indicator as Tier 1 was that you would need data for at least 50% of countries. And many global and thematic indicators are still below that threshold. So next, we're going to reporting of progress for the SDGs, for SDG 4. And here the main forum, not only for SDG 4, but for all SDGs, is the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. This is an event that takes place every year. It looks every year at a rotating set of goals. And in 2019, Goal 4 on education will be on the agenda. The inputs into the high-level political forum come from mainly from these voluntary national reviews that I mentioned earlier. There are also contributions by other organizations that work in this field. For example, UNESCO contributes to this. There are the annual progress reports by the UN Secretary General. There are also the regional meetings that provide information and input into these high-level political fora. And there are expert meetings. So the voluntary national reviews, I talked about them already, so I don't have to go into detail again here. I just one additional piece of information. So these are voluntary, and you can hear, you have a count here that says that between 2016 and 2019, there were 143 voluntary national reviews, or there will be if you include 2019. And that includes some countries that have carried out more than one review. So you see that if you look at, for example, 2018, 47 national reviews, that means that 2/3 or three-quarters of countries are not carrying out a national review in 2018 because it is voluntary.
Do you want to start wrapping up this part?
Yeah.
A few left.
This is. I'm wrapping up the first part.
Okay, good.
Perfect timing, Joost. Which is the second part, then would bring me to the role of the UIS. So maybe we'll take a little break here if you want.
Yeah, thank you. I think this was. I have quite a few questions already on my mind, but thank you for the very thorough introduction to this complex theme. Very rich. I think we should open it up for a first set of questions or remarks from the audience, including our online visitors. Okay, I would have a question. Oh yeah, please, sir. Go ahead. Yeah.
Part of UNESCO, with UNESCO, who are supporting.
So that's the question. So the question is, what is the UIS and how does it relate to UNESCO, and what is our role? You may have missed that at the beginning when I introduced the UIS. The UIS is the Statistical Institute of UNESCO, so we are part of UNESCO, but we are independent in a way because we are based in Montreal, whereas UNESCO is based in Paris, and there's a reason for that. In fact, if you look at the history of the US, the UNESCO used to have a statistical division, but as you can imagine, every time it comes to measurement and reporting on countries, some countries don't like the data because they don't look so good compared to other countries. And so if you are in Paris, it's easier for countries to exert pressure on the statistical division than if the institute was somewhere far away on a different continent.
So we are working without distinctions, all over the world, without not necessarily better on some region than.
No, the UIS is responsible for all countries of the world. So we are now in Montreal, which gives us some of the independence that the old statistical division did not have. I can also say that there are regular evaluations, since just on that point, because I don't want to leave that open, of the UIS, and it is given a high rating as an institute that does a good job and performs independently and is very professional in its reporting. And we are responsible for all countries of the world in the sectors of UNESCO, so that's education, science, and culture. But of course, we emphasize working with less developed countries because one of our responsibilities is statistical capacity building. And let's say here we are in Switzerland. Switzerland doesn't need help from the UIS. They have an excellent system in place. There are other countries with which we work with, and I could talk about more about it in the second part of my presentation.
Okay. Yes, please.
That there is a naming and ranking and shaming process, or if yes, what is there an alternative that is proposed by the UIS to voluntary assessments?
Yeah, so I have to repeat the question.
Yes,
so the question was about reporting by countries on progress, and specifically given that it's voluntary, why do relatively few countries carry out these voluntary national reviews every year? And is there possibly the problem that if you do that, you may be subject to naming and shaming? I hope that summarizes the question. That's a difficult question for me to answer. And the UIS, for example, makes a very conscious decision. We do not publish rankings of countries because of that. So if you go to our database, you will not find the table of, let's say, the top 10 of learning outcomes or the worst performing in learning outcomes, because we want to exactly avoid that naming and shaming, because that doesn't help anyone. At the same time, you cannot avoid countries being compared with each other, and that's one of the reasons for existence of the UIS, to provide internationally comparable statistics. So you can compare how countries perform relative to the targets for SDG 4, and I don't know if if some countries don't want to report because they feel that they are not performing well. I cannot say that. It is certainly true that if you look at the statistics or the voluntary national reviews, this includes countries from all levels of development, including some of the worst performing countries. So I think it really comes back then to, is there commitment in countries to work towards the goals and the targets of the 2030 agenda and to improve their systems? And this is actually one of the really more important questions to discuss when we look at the likelihood of achieving them, because there is an aspect of, let's say, goodwill in countries and really a willingness to achieve these goals that I think is probably not present in all environments. There's also, of course, the fact that some countries are in difficult situations. They are fragile states or countries that are in a situation of conflict. Of course, it would make it much more difficult for them to improve their systems than countries that live at peace and at a high level of economic development.
I would have a question online here, and I would like to add one question to that. Sorry? Yeah, this is a question from Charlotte Karen. She asks, more on data availability. Are challenges that arise from data gathering clearly identified? And in this case, are there actions that are being taken to overcome those challenges? So, but before that question, there's another question I would like to put into the group, and I think everybody has that same reaction, and then the two questions can be treated together, is it seems so much. There's so many indicators. Isn't there sort of a sense of, overkill? I mean, this is a provocative question, obviously. And that relates also to the question that Sabina raised at the beginning, do they really capture the most essential elements? If we talk about holistic quality of education, how can we capture that through, by definition, reductionary indicators? So one is, the number of indicators, and two, is their availability, the question that Charlotte asked.
Yeah. So on the first question that you just asked, you realize that there is a conflict between having a holistic view of education that tries to capture everything and anything, and at the same time to have a, say, more compact monitoring framework that would be easier to monitor. Just on the thematic framework, I'll just give you one example. The first proposal by the group working on the thematic indicators had 70 indicators. And that's already almost cut in half. We were down to 32 additional indicators that were added to the global framework. So this 70 indicator framework would probably have been more holistic, if we want to put it that way, and I don't know what was included there that is not included now. I would argue that the current indicator framework, now I'm speaking of this as a representative of the UIS, where we are the custodian of these indicators. So I may be somewhat biased, I will admit. I think it is a good indicator framework. Actually, I'm probably less biased because we didn't develop the indicators, they were developed by countries. We are just here now to monitor progress towards these indicators and to give guidance on indicators that need further methodological development. I think that, for example, if you look at target 4.1, the set of indicators that we had there that I showed on one slide is a good set of indicators. You could probably argue that some of them are better than others, especially when we look at problems in reporting on them. And this comes back now to the question of the challenges.
And the availability
of data. So what are the reasons for this? One is that statistical systems in countries may be weak. So there may be countries that don't have well-established education management information systems. There may be countries that don't have the means, and this includes both financial means and the human resources to carry out good learning assessments or good household surveys. And so some of these challenges are also regularly discussed at the fora that take place, for example, the high-level political forum or meetings that held by UNESCO to monitor progress towards the SDGs. And one important thing that always comes up is the funding gap. Because funding or monitoring requires resources, so you need money to collect the data, you need money to analyze the data, you need money to report the data. The UIS tries to help with that through statistical capacity building that I can talk again more about later. And in terms of funding, we try to work with other organizations to really raise awareness of that in terms of advocacy building. For example, we try to promote the utility of household surveys. Household surveys are, as I said, very important for SDG 4 because of this availability of disaggregated data. Countries don't always, or traditionally have not always trusted them because they're not always carried out by national statistical offices, but they may be carried out by an organization, that say UNICEF comes in and then works with a government agency to carry out a country. So they may not be as open to using the data from these sources, such as household surveys, as they would be from their own statistical systems, because they might have more trust in administrative records. But we should try to change that by raising awareness about the usefulness of household surveys, for example, or learning assessments, because in the end they really help the government. Because we assume still that countries want for example, their children to do well. They want everybody to have the proper skills for decent work. And that's why we try to work with other organizations and with countries to improve their capacity to report on the goals.
Okay, just to remind, we have a meeting on the second session on Friday will be on household surveys, so we'll be able to share more on that. Please, and also react to, give your opinion in terms of how do you think that the number of indicators and their availability is an important aspect that we need to take into consideration. Please, madam.
Some of the global funds, such as the Global Partnership for Education sector grants, Education Cannot Wait applications, are they actually using the willingness to engage with these indicators as part of those applications? How much willingness is there to engage with these indicators by the global funds on education? I have to admit I don't know the answer to that. I do know that the indicators are regularly reported to agencies, and I hope that they will be used because that's the purpose, especially the purpose of data reported by the US, because we make them internationally comparable, and we hope that then they will be a more useful piece of evidence for decision making by global funds, for example, on where resources should be allocated. So I don't know to what extent they are being used, but I hope that they are being used, and I would be surprised if they are not used.
Other questions or comments or sharing of experience also in terms of the use, the effective use, because I mean, you said, Friedrich, it's about collecting, analyzing and reporting, but it's also about acting, right? I mean, the data are there for a purpose, and I mean, they have to provide the levers to know where to act, and how is that sort of dimension? It's beyond the purview, obviously, of UIS, but I mean, in the end, it's a means to an end. And it's not a means as such, an end as such. And the issue with indicators, after beyond this discussion here, but in general, is that they become a goal in itself, and can be tricky in that sense. It's about the use of the indicators, even including in the international fora. Maybe people around the table have also experience to share here. Question by Yvette Gatilao Murphy. It's a little bit related, a little bit disconnected from your remark here. It seems we were behind in terms of capacity to monitor, measure, and report data in most countries that in formulating the SDGs. Data collection should have been a goal in itself. What role do regional cooperation or any level of cooperation exist to support countries who lack the capacity to collect data? And are there any good examples you can share?
Yeah. Maybe I'll start with this question that we got online, and then I will maybe move to the second part, because we really have several questions now about the role of the US and specifically what is the UIS doing in this whole process. So on the regional, the role of regional mechanisms, there are, as I mentioned earlier, there is this regional level of monitoring, and there are good examples of regional mechanisms. I will mention as an example East Asia. In East Asia, the regional monitoring of SDG 4 is coordinated by a group that is that includes UNESCO and UNICEF at an office in Bangkok, that holds regular meetings, and that also then identifies, for example, gaps in countries. Where are certain data gaps, or what are some of the statistical capacity needs? And these kind of mechanisms also exist in other countries. I know Latin America, for example, is very strong in that. In Africa, there's the African Union that is working on it. So these mechanisms do exist, and this is a very important component of monitoring for SDG 4 and of reporting of data. So maybe I'll talk a bit more about the role of the UIS.
Before we go there, Moibar, you have a question.
Yeah. So
thanks for the clarification.
So
yes,
there was someone in the audience just mentioned goal 17 among the SDGs as something that looks more about the partnerships and strengthening of systems. And I'm glad you mentioned that because in the high-level political forum, as I said, there's a rotating set of goals, and because of the importance of goal 17, that is discussed every year.
Okay, so this is the second part of the role about UIS.
Yes.
Maybe we have another 20 minutes, so this takes a...
Yeah. So I will
let's leave some space.
Breeze through some of my slides. Some of this we talked about already. And so what is the UIS doing? There are three key activities by the UIS. One is development of methodologies and standards. Then there is data collection, analysis, and dissemination of internationally comparable data, emphasis on internationally comparable, and then capacity building and advocacy. And through all of this, we are really trying to build a global public good of standards, methodologies, and data that can be used by anyone and then would be hopefully helpful to anyone working on the SDG 4 agenda. In methodologies and standards, so we heard already that the UIS is the custodian for 40 of the 43 global and thematic SDG 4 indicators, and also a partner for the remaining 3 indicators in this framework. And we are also maintaining something like the International Standard Classification of Education, which is the basis of all internationally comparable statistics on education. There are some initiatives that are supported by the US. There is the TCG, which is this group that leads on the development of the indicators for SDG 4. There is a related initiative by the US, the Global Alliance to monitor learning. This is similar to the TCG, but with a focus on learning outcomes indicators. And a third group is the interagency group on education inequality indicators, which looks specifically at data related to equity and therefore a lot at household survey data. Very briefly on data flows for SDG 4, this just shows how the UIS is, where the US is located in this process. So the source of all data are national statistical systems. They're reported to the UIS in cooperation with some of regional or international organizations, and the UIS then builds a database for SDG 4, which hopefully at some point will have data for all 11 global and the 43 thematic indicators. We are not there yet because in some cases we don't have a methodology or we don't have data. This database in turn is then used by the UN Statistics Division to build its global database on SDG indicators, which serves as the source of data for the annual progress report by the UN Secretary General, and also goes into the high-level political forum and other ways of using the data. Finally, capacity building and advocacy. Here I want to mention one program by UNESCO, which is called Capacity Development for Education, or CAP-ED. Here the US engages with countries, including some of the countries that that you talked about, the least developed countries. So here we have really the countries like Niger, DRC, Haiti, Afghanistan, Nepal, and so on. These are some of the least developed countries where we work with them to improve their statistical capacity. We train the national statisticians, we map data sources, identify gaps that exist. We also provide tools for assessment of data quality that are developed by the UIS, and that is both with regard to administrative data and household survey data. And then of course we promote best practices, and this connects to something that you talked about earlier, which is the use of the data. One of the reasons why the US exists, or one of the reasons for work, is that we want to provide the best available evidence for policymakers so that they can make the right decisions about where resources would be invested or where some of the gaps exist in countries. So while this is, the use of the data itself is beyond the mandate of the UIS, we promote very much the use of the data. For example, there is, as part of this quick guide series, and one of them we are launching today, we also had recently a quick guide that talks about learning assessments. And one of the main audiences of that is national policymakers, to show them why learning assessments are important and how they can help them achieve their goals. We are currently working on a related set of guides on household survey data, which is exactly for the same reason. We want to show why household surveys are important, how they can help countries achieve their goals and improve their education systems. And then we advocate for resource mobilizations, as I mentioned earlier. So now we come to this new quick guide here. And I will need maybe 5 more minutes to go through this. So first of all, I'm very happy that we have the chance to launch this here today. In this quick guide, so this is, we call it a quick guide because it is really written to be less heavy than some of the other documents that the US publishes or that UN organizations publish, especially concerning methodology. I'll give you one example. If you really want to know how the indicators are calculated, you have to look at this document here, which is only available in electronic form. This is a 100-page document only with indicators, the SDG4 indicators. So this has the definitions, calculation methods, data sources, and everything. This quick guide here is a sort of the quick and easy version of that, which looks only at the global indicators. And it answers some of the questions that we talked about today. For example, what is SDG4? What tools exist to measure progress? What is the role of the US in this? And how are the indicators developed and calculated? It also has a list of all the targets and indicators. And the indicator pages, I'll give you one example. Here is the page for indicator 4.5.1. It's the parity indices. Okay. So for each of these indicators, we provide the concept that it's intended to measure. We have a definition, a calculation method. We provide some guidance on interpretation of the data, on data sources, and also some of the methodological challenges that exist. There's some slides I'm going to skip here. So I had one example prepared that, because I know my colleague on Friday will, as I understand, will give a quite technical presentation. And so I thought maybe I'll try to be a bit methodological too, since we are the UIS, but now
Get some statistics.
I just skip through this slide. I think Sabina would have been very happy with that, but we can talk about that later. So the purpose of that, just to tell you briefly, was that if you think about the parity index, so give me 2 minutes to talk about it. The parity index is a very commonly used indicator that has been used for many years, especially if you may have heard of the gender parity index. That's calculated by dividing the female value of an indicator by the male value of an indicator. But even there is room for methodological development and improvement. So the UIS has proposed this so-called adjusted parity index, which addresses some methodological weaknesses of the other index as it's currently being used. And one of them is that the unadjusted parity index has no upper range, no upper limit, and it is not symmetrical around 1. So this sounds a bit technical. I can't give you all the detail now, but believe me, it's very important. So with the adjusted parity index, we are trying to address that, and the UIS published for the first time last year this adjusted parity index, and we also made the decision this year with our September data release to remove all unadjusted parity indexes from the database, because we really want people to use this new adjusted parity index. So now a related publication to this quick guide, which is a companion product that's also being launched today, is this SDG4 data book that you see on the screen here. Yes. This is not available in print, it's only in electronic format. It's basically a series of statistical tables for the global indicators. You have, and for each of those you have also information on data availability by region. This is an example of an indicator for availability is quite high. This is participation in education before the age of entry into primary education, so participation in pre-primary education basically. This is a tier 1 indicator. As you see, it is a well-established methodology, and data coverage is very high, more than 70% at the global level. We will update this in September when the latest data becomes available, and at that point we may even print it. Then there are some online products that the UIS produces. This is an area that is relatively new for us. We don't really have traditionally a lot of, let's say, skill or strength in providing this kind of data visualizations, but they are very important because, let's say something like this, which is just a book full of statistical tables, is a bit tedious to look at. Right? It's not engaging. So data visualizations are really more interesting for many people, and also they make the data more accessible, which is one of these ways for us to try to improve the use of the data. So we have this data explorer, and if you came in, you may have picked up this sheet here. This is just a one-page flyer here. You will find on this page here links to these documents. So we have here the quick guide, we have the data book, and then there's a link to this database that you see on the screen here. And so this has data for all global and thematic indicators by country.
You will, by the way, you'll find the links of what you just said on the blog that we posted this morning on the quick guide and the other documents.
Great, appreciate that.
On the NORRAG website.
And then the last one product that's also listed here are these new country profiles. These are also on the US website. These are simply summaries of data in chart format for the global indicators for individual countries. If you go to the link today, you will see old country profiles. I was told that wait until tomorrow and they're going to be there.
Okay.
That's tomorrow Montreal time, I think. Let me just mention one more product, which is our online data center. This is not something new. This is just a set of statistical tables that you can access to find data for all indicators, global and thematic indicators. You can also download the data for your own analysis. So maybe that's the last thing that I wanted to mention here now. And so I appreciate you will make some of this information available. And of course, you can also go to the US website. Maybe I'll just show you my contact information here.
Okay.
Or you will also have that on your website, maybe.
Yes.
So people can then email me, and I will try to answer that myself, or will get in touch with some of my colleagues who might be able to help you. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Friedrich, for this very comprehensive overview. We have more time for some questions, and I have some additional questions online also. So I'd leave it to the floor. Any questions, remarks? Please, madam. Yeah.
And going back to something Sabina said about children in conflict situations, or I mean, we all know that the numbers of children on the move or caught up in unstable situations is increasing and
So it's about measuring. You're saying that it's not only about math and literacy, it's also about life skills. And to what extent are these promoted by some of the powerful players, but also reflected to some extent in the SDG framework?
Yeah, and of course, I'm not saying that, and I think no one who works on the SDGs, on the current indicator frameworks, we're not saying that these are the only indicators they should look at. This is a relatively limited set of indicators, even with 43 indicators. And the voluntary national reviews, for example, they can report on anything they want. There is no set format for that. It doesn't say that they should only report on the global and thematic indicators. They may report on some of the issues that you raised, for example. And we hope that those reports and others will include some of the issues that you talked about, because they are indeed very important.
Yes, please.
Just to echo on this.
If you statistic at the beginning, we are just on 3 years since the beginning of SDGs. Maybe later, or maybe I don't know when, private sector will be more involved to reach the SDGs as previously.
Okay, so this is a comment saying, I mean, that you think that at some point the private sector will also step up in the whole SDG discussion and implementation. And the second point, that would be my interpretation, saying there's other aspects like health, you mentioned, and is there any, in that sense, my reading would be, how are the various indicators also related amongst, between the various SDGs? In that sense, I mean, SDG 4 is one, but of course it also has impact and it is related to the other SDG targets.
Yeah, there is of course a set of 17 goals that are all related to each other. Education is related to many of these goals. I think you can just go online, you find numerous examples of people where people are trying to connect the different goals. On the private sector, I would just want to give one example. There's one meeting that I didn't talk about, which is the global education meeting that takes place in December of this year, which is a meeting that is organized by UNESCO. It's a follow-up to the 2015 World Education Forum, which adopted which the thematic indicator framework was proposed. And so this is a very high-level meeting with ministers and senior officials, with representatives of international organizations, but it also includes participants from the private sector, because they are very important. The role of the private sector is recognized, not least as a possible source of funding for some of the work that has to be done related to SDG 4 and other goals.
Sabina.
I have one question with regards to equity in general, and the equity topic related to crisis, or you have it here, conflict affected, but I would hold it larger, not just conflict affected populations, but crisis affected populations. I mean, equity is such an important issue in the SDG 4, but when I look at target 4.5, that is actually the equity target, and I look at the thematic indicators, I find them, and that's now my personal view, I find them rather weak. So how much equity is actually reflected in the targets and indicators of the SDG 4 monitoring framework?
Well, this global indicator for target 4.5 equity is, so the basic is this parity index that I talked about, and that should be calculated for all of the indicators on the list of indicators. To what extent does that, so are you talking about here more about the difference between equality and equity, or is that what you're trying to get at? There's this debate, let's say you can be equal in terms of the indicator value, but it doesn't mean that you have, let's say, the same equity. There's a difference to equity as opposed to equality.
Yeah, probably it's both. Yeah. So I can be more specific, but that's just representative, maybe also for other disadvantaged groups. But if you take now crisis-affected populations, IDP and refugees, be it from conflict or other sources. So I would have expected a specific thematic indicator for this target group in the monitoring framework. It is such an important issue globally. It is an issue raised by the Global Partnership for Education. There is Education Cannot Wait, etc. So I'm a little bit astonished that such an indicator doesn't figure on the thematic indicator.
Yeah, well, I think that's a valid criticism of the indicator framework as it is defined. And I have to admit that crisis or conflict-affected populations, as they are called it here in the name of the indicator, are a big challenge for the UIS. It's very hard to get data on that. They are very often not included in national reporting. Some countries purposely exclude them from the systems, and others there's just this difficulty of, let's say, going to a refugee camp and making sure you're not double counting people, or they may move on. So then what is the numerator and what is the denominator of an indicator? It's very challenging, both in terms of first getting the data and then even calculating the indicators. For the UIS, that's something that we have on our to-do list in the very near future, and I really want to emphasize very near future. We are moving step by step. So when you look at this indicator 4.5, it mentions, and I'm going to read this out now, it mentions female male, which has been done for many years. It talks about rural urban, which we have also been doing and are doing more now. Then it talks about wealth analysis, which the UIS has begun to report in its online data center 2 years ago. Disability status is also a new field of work. So here the UIS for the first time published a fact sheet on education and disability in 2017. In 2018 we had a more substantial information paper with data for 49 countries on the links between education and disability. And one of the next things that we want to look at is in fact this refugees or migrants. But it is very challenging and we need partners. For example, we are on that connecting with UNHCR. They have a data collection, their refugee EMIS system. We have obtained some data from that. We found it, however, very difficult to analyze that and to be able to arrive at statistics that we would be confident enough to disseminate as something that is reliable. But we are working on that, and we hope that we can make a lot of progress over the next months and years.
Okay, thank you. Please, if you're starting to wrap up, go ahead, please.
So the question was about data collection by different organizations from countries, specifically different international organizations, and to what extent they collaborate on, for example, data exchange. I'm glad you brought that up because that is something that we are very conscious of. We not just UNESCO, the UIS, but also other organizations, UNICEF, even GPE, the Global Partnership for Education, was mentioned earlier as an organization that collects data for their monitoring framework. The World Bank, other organizations. We're really trying to coordinate. We as international organizations trying to coordinate this to reduce the response burden of countries. So for example, UNICEF would not try to go to countries and collect data on teachers or education finance, because that's the mandate of UNESCO or the UIS. So UNESCO, the UIS carries out this data collection, and then we report that to UNICEF for their needs. Similarly, UNICEF, for example, carries out the mixed surveys, and then those are provided to other organizations that work that would want to analyze the data that's collected from mix. So there is probably no way to completely eliminate, let's say, duplicated data requests from organizations. But if that appears, I think there's also a responsibility for the country then to bring that to the attention of the organization that collected data, so that could be eliminated, these duplicated requests, because indeed we want to not have them waste their scarce human resources on filling out questionnaires for many different organizations. And I think coordination is also improving, partly because of the monitoring needs for SDG 4.
Okay, that's good news. Final questions. I have one final question online before we wrap up, and it is interesting, I think, by Charlotte Karen. Considering various incentives to build education systems resilience in fragile and conflict-affected contexts by using technology, iPads, iPhones, e-learning, could big data, we haven't spoken about big data yet, be used for any of the SDG 4 global or thematic indicators? Has there been thinking about this?
So short answer, yes.
There has been thinking about it.
Long answer, I can't really give you a long answer because I don't have the detail. Say in terms of technology, that is not something that the UIS would be involved in, because we, as an institute, we get aggregated data from countries. We don't go to households, or we don't go to refugee camps and ask the people there to fill out questionnaires. Of course, we work with other organizations on improving ways of collecting data. That includes, for example, making use of technology. So let's say if you talk about organizations that carry out household surveys, they no longer do this on paper. They go now with a tablet and collect the data that way. For big data, there is a UN group that looks at big data and the use of big data for monitoring purposes. I don't have a lot of information. Can you maybe say anything about it?
Is it UN Burst?
I can't say no. So, but I have seen big data raised in the UN system as a source of data and possible ways of using that data, but I don't have a really lot of information on that.
More work to be done. Final remarks, maybe Sabina, anything you want to add, wrapping up? Friedrich?
No, just thank you again for this opportunity. I hope it was useful for everyone here in the room and also online.
Yes, so I don't want to repeat what you just said. We have the same wish, and I thank you again for taking time to come, both Sabina and Friedrich, and also using Geneva as the official launch of this very useful guide, I guess, because it's a very complex theme and there's so many ramifications. And it is a challenge. I mean, but for me, the big challenge is to make a pragmatic use of this indicator framework so that information is generated that can lead to action. I think that is the important element. There was one question that was on my mind, but we'll maybe ask during the break. I mean, since SDG is a universal framework, all the countries are supposed to report. And I was wondering whether Switzerland is preparing its voluntary reporting for SDG 4 for next year. But maybe you can talk about that when we have lunch.
They do. We do.
So that being said, thank you very much. And we just enjoyed the nice park also. And don't forget, the second session on National Household Service will be on the same location on Friday, same time. So thank you again.
Thank you.